For the next few minutes, I want to talk about applying Old Testament narratives. I want to talk about some of the things that have been said by scholars about the Old Testament narratives, and then talk a little bit more from a Christian perspective on how you might apply them to today. First of all, the way that we look at the Old Testament as Christians today, that is the way the Old Testament is organized in our Bible, is not the way that the earliest Christians conceptualized the contents of the Hebrew Bible. For example, Jesus does not talk about the Jewish Scriptures with the same divisions that we might think about in terms of our Old Testaments. And so basically, throughout the New Testament, you will see the phrase the law and the prophets. That really is a shorthand for the Jewish Scriptures, for the Hebrew Bible, for what we call the Old Testament. And the reason for that is that the Jews at the time of Christ conceptualized the Scriptures as in terms of two main groupings and maybe a third. Now the first collection, again, remember, we're not talking about a book at this point. The book form really wasn't used at that time. We're talking about a collection of scrolls, and the way that Jews thought of those scrolls as being grouped. So the first collection of such scrolls is the 5 scrolls, the Pentateuch. Penta means 5, Tuch means scrolls. What were those 5 scrolls? They were Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This collection of scrolls is the Torah, the law. And so now that much is the same between the Christian Old Testament and the Jewish Bible. Those first 5 books are the same in any Bible, whether it's a Jewish Bible or a Christian Bible. The second part, however, is a little different. Remember, I was saying a second ago that the New Testament several times talks about the law and the prophets. That's a shorthand for the Jewish Scriptures. So the second grouping of Scriptures for Jews at the time of Christ are the prophets. And so whenever, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus says in Matthew 5, "I've not come to destroy the law and the prophets," that is basically a reference to, I've not come to destroy the Scriptures. I've not come to break the Scriptures. I've come to give you a fulfilled understanding of the Scriptures. Similarly, when in Matthew 7 it says that therefore whatever you would have people do to you, do to them, the golden rule. On this the law and the prophets hang. Again, what are we saying? We're saying that the Scriptures, this basically is the full understanding of what the Scriptures are all about. Paul in Romans 3 kind of shifts between meanings of the word law. He says, "But now a righteousness of God has been revealed apart from law," that is, apart from works of law, apart from especially those parts of the law that Jews made Jews, even though it is witnessed by the law and the prophets. He shifted from law as legal to law as the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, the Scriptures, in other words, that the righteousness of God in Jesus is witnessed by the Old Testament Scriptures, is what Paul is saying. Although, again, he wouldn't have called it the Old Testament Scriptures; they were just the Scriptures. What were the parts of the prophets at the time? Well, they divided it into the former prophets and the latter prophets. The latter prophets are the prophets as we're used to thinking of prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12 refers to Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, and so forth. But they also considered Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings as being part of the prophetic section, or the section's not the right word because that's a book, that's book speak, but the prophetic grouping of writings, of scrolls. So they considered those parts of the prophets. Notice that Ruth is not there, Esther's not there. Samuel and Kings were not 1st and 2nd Samuel until it got translated into Greek. Hebrew doesn't have vowels, and so the Hebrew of Samuel is shorter than the Greek of Samuel. It has to be split out. So that's the prophets. And again, we find witness to this threefold division. The third part is the writings. So when in Luke 24, when Jesus is unfolding the scriptures to the men on the way to Emmaus, he unfolds them for them the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Well, the Psalms are the lead-off hitter of the writing collection. So this threefold division's maybe not the right word. The threefold grouping of the Jewish scriptures was the way that Jesus and others at the time of Christ were thinking or conceptualizing what we call as Christians the Old Testament. That the precise limits of the writings at the time of Christ do not seem to have been set. That is, the edges of the Old Testament canon were a little bit fuzzy, arguably, at the time of Jesus. Notice what's in the rest, as it were, and the rest. Wisdom literature is in the writings. That's Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Daniel, believe it or not, is in the writings. Some would put it there because they think it's later, or some think it's there because it's later. Some think it's there because it's not prophetic, but more wisdom literature. Those are various explanations that have come up over the years as to why Daniel's in the writings and not in the prophets. And then the five scrolls is books like Esther and Lamentations and Ruth and so forth. So those are the three groupings of the Hebrew Bible. We group it differently, but this is the way Jews at the time of Jesus understood the contents of Scripture to be divided. And of course, this is all, even today, the way that the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is divided. Okay, well, let's go into the law. Talk a little bit about the law. There are various genres of literature in the law, mostly narrative. So Genesis is mostly narrative, Exodus is mostly narrative, that is story. Numbers is mostly narrative, Deuteronomy has a lot of narrative. When we talk about applying the stories of the Old Testament or the narratives of the Old Testament, you can see that a great lot of the Old Testament of the law is narrative. Of course, there are other genres there. So there is a lot of legal material in Exodus. There's a lot of legal material in Leviticus. Leviticus is almost all legal material. Deuteronomy has a lot of legal material. So if narrative is the majority genre of the law, there is also very significant amounts of legal material in the law. And there's other stuff. There's poetry in various places. An etiology is an explanation for why you do something or why something is the way it is. So when Jacob wrestles with the angel touches his thigh and it goes, I think it goes out of socket, and that explains why Israelites don't eat certain parts of anatomy of animals. That's an etiology, explaining why we do certain things the way we do certain things. Why don't snakes have legs? That sort of thing. So there's a rundown of the genres of the law. Now, for several hundred years, it has been very common in scholarly circles to talk about sources being behind the Pentateuch. In the earliest days, one of the very early suggestions was that Moses had used different sources. So, for example, if you read Genesis very carefully, you'll find that there are very similar stories to each other in Genesis. So, for example, you have Abraham lying to Pharaoh about Sarah being his sister, and then you have Abraham lying to Abimelech about Sarah being his sister. And one of the things that was noticed very early on, in the early 1800s, for example, maybe even in the 1700s, is that a lot of these very similar stories use different names for God. So I forget which is which, but the Abraham, Sarah, and Abimelech has one name for God, and the Abraham, Sarah, and Pharaoh has another name for God. So there are a number of places where you have very similar stories where one uses one name for God and the other uses another. If you can do this with the flood, story, for example, if you were to take all the verses of the flood story and put in one column all the verses that used Elohim, which is one of the generic word for God, and if you put in another column all the verses that use Yahweh, which is God's actual proper name, you would find that if, as you went down those two columns, that they basically end up telling the same story with some variation. So the Elohim version has 7, if I remember correctly. The Elohim verses have 7 of every clean animal on the ark, whereas the Yahweh column would have 2 of every kind. And so I think one of them has a dove, the other has a raven, that sort of thing. Now you can say, well, it's just coincidence, or come up with some other explanation for it. But very early on, there were some who suggested that, well, maybe Moses had 2 different sources that he used to put Genesis together. Of course, eventually it would be suggested that Moses didn't write it at all, for Genesis doesn't even mention Moses. Genesis doesn't say it's written by Moses. The problem is, of course, or the complication for this line of thinking, is that Jesus and other New Testament authors seem to refer to Moses as the author of the Pentateuch. Now, I do want to say that most of the time when the New Testament says that Moses said something, it is quoting quotes of Moses in the Pentateuch. That is to say, most of the time when the New Testament says something in relation to Moses, in relation to the Pentateuch, it's not talking about the story of Genesis or Exodus. It's quoting quotes in Exodus that Moses said. However, having said that, there are a few places where Jesus or a New Testament author speaks of Moses as the writer, and it's talking about the story, and it's not talking about a quote of Moses. And so this is where we get into this question: are Jesus and the New Testament authors simply using the paradigms of their day? Everybody thinks Moses wrote these, and therefore they are speaking in those categories. Or is this an inspired reference of authorship? That's the debate. And so, again, my purpose in this video is not to push you in one direction or the other, but to expose you to some of these lines of thinking that have been out there. So the most famous kind of theory of how the Pentateuch came together is called the documentary hypothesis. Now, this was very strongly rejected by conservative Christians when it came out for a number of reasons, one of which, and the most significant of which, is the one I just mentioned. The fact that a few places, not a lot, but there are a few places where New Testament authors and Jesus refer to Moses as the writer of the narrative. Not frequent, but it is there. And so that's probably the reason, the strongest reason, why there continues to be significant opposition to source theories. And this is interesting because, again, there isn't as much strong opposition to source theories of the Gospels. So the theory that Mark was written first and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, that gets far less opposition as a theory than the idea that the Pentateuch might have sources and not be written by Moses. And so the strongest reason for that is the fact that Jesus and others talk about them as if Moses wrote the narrative. But there are other reasons, probably. One is that the guy that first really put this together, he didn't originate all the parts, but he really put it together, was a German by the name of Julius Wellhausen. And let's just say that he wasn't a particularly faith-friendly kind of theoretician. At least Christians with a very strong belief in the Bible did not experience him as being a real cheery man of faith, so to speak. That probably is part of why the documentary hypothesis was so strongly rejected when it first came out. Another reason is, of course, is that it was the first of this kind of a real hypothesis to go really public. The two source hypothesis of the Gospels came later, after this had already kind of broken the ice, so to speak. Those are possible some explanations for why this was so vigorously opposed when it first came out in certain circles. Well, I should also say that Old Testament scholars have not just simply gone with this. That over the last 150 years or so, Old Testament scholarship continues to think that the idea of sources is a strong hypothesis, but they don't necessarily just spit out what Wellhausen suggested. They have modified Wellhausen over the years. Well, what was the theory? Let's come out and say it. Well, the theory is sometimes called JEDP, where those letters represent different sources that Wellhausen thought might be have been behind the Pentateuch. So, one of them he called the J source, because in German Yahweh begins with a J, and so he thought perhaps there was an early epic, that is a heroic story of Israel's prehistory, that is the days prior to Israel becoming the nation, before them having a king, and so forth, that there might have been this early epic of Israel's prehistory around the time of David, around 1000 BC, and that this epic used the word Yahweh for God from the beginning. Then Wellhausen suggested there might have been another version of the story that was used, say, in the northern kingdom. A little bit later, maybe it arose on the north side of the border. So if we're going to have our own kingdom here in the north, then we've got to have our own version of the epic. And in this version, Wellhausen suggested, God was only called Elohim until Moses. And then, when Moses came on the scene, God revealed himself as Yahweh. And of course, Wellhausen he wasn't just making this up, he was looking at verses in the text. And there is a verse in Exodus where God tells Moses, well, I was known to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. They did not know me as Yahweh, but I'm revealing myself now as Yahweh. And so the theory of Wellhausen is that in the E epic, God was only known as Elohim until the time of Moses, and at that point the name Yahweh was revealed. That would explain why in a certain strand of Genesis you only have Elohim. Well, Wellhausen called this the E source. I'm not sure that contemporary scholarship thinks that there was an E source. This is part of the theory that I think has been questioned. I don't know why. This is not my area. I just want you to have heard it before, because it is something that most people who've studied the Old Testament have heard, and so I'm wanting you to know the scoop. Wellhausen also suggested that there was a D source, which stands for Deuteronomy. Wellhausen suggested that when the book of the law was found in the temple in the days of Josiah, that this was the book of Deuteronomy that was found, not the whole Pentateuch, but just the book of the law. And so Wellhausen would have made a distinction between Deuteronomy as the book of the law, which is mentioned, for example, in the beginning of Joshua, and the book of Moses, which is mentioned in the book of Ezra. Wellhausen would suggest that early on it was just the book of the law, Deuteronomy. But then by the time of Ezra, after the exile, the book of Moses now refers to all five of the books of the law. And then, of course, Wellhausen thought that there was a priestly writer, the P writer, who edited all together, put the Genesis 1 on as a kind of preface, and was interested in some of the holiness, purity material of Leviticus, and so forth. So that's kind of a very quick version of Wellhausen's source hypothesis that came out, in the late 1800s. Again, Old Testament scholarship hasn't stopped. It's continued. This has been modified. It went through some silly phases, no doubt, and you can completely reject it. But that's called the documentary hypothesis. there is less opposition to the idea that before, this is another theory having to do with Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. These books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are sometimes called the Deuteronomistic history. And one version of this theory is that before Deuteronomy became incorporated into the Pentateuch, that it had been associated with a history of Israel that went from the conquest of Canaan to the exile, and that these books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings all go together. You don't find as much opposition to this for several reasons. For one, I suppose most people have never heard of it, and it's hard to oppose something you've never heard of. A second reason is because the New Testament doesn't actually tell us who the authors of these books are. Joshua probably was not written by Joshua. I mean, why would it be? It's about Joshua. It never says, I, Joshua, did this. Samuel wasn't written by Samuel. I mean, it goes way beyond the death of Samuel, and it never says that Samuel's the writer. It's about Samuel in the third person. Who would we even say Kings was by? Elijah, Elisha, they all die in Kings, and it goes on long after them. Who was Judges written by? I mean, we really have no idea. We have no idea who these books were written by. And so not only do they not seem to be written by anybody we know, but there's nobody in the New Testament that quotes them as being by anybody we know, and therefore we're free to theorize to our heart's content, and nobody gets offended. These books seem to have a similar theological perspective, and that theological perspective is sometimes called Deuteronomistic theology, and it's based on some of the theology at the end of Deuteronomy, where it says, if you keep my commandments, I will bless you when you go in, and I will bless you when you come out, and I'll bless you, bless you, bless you, bless you. But if you don't keep my commandments, I will curse you when you go out, and I'll curse you when you come in, and I'll curse you, curse you, curse you, curse you. So that idea that those who obey the Lord are blessed in this world, and those that disobey the Lord are cursed in this world, that theology is found throughout Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. For example, Judges is a cycle of Israel obeying God, and God frees them from slavery, and then they serve other gods, and then God gives them into slavery. That is, of course, as we'll see in a slide in a second, that is not the whole picture, because sometimes the heathen prosper, sometimes the righteous suffer. But Deuteronomy doesn't really go into that part of the picture. Deuteronomy sticks more to the much simpler, God blesses those who keep His commandments, and those who don't keep His commandments get fried. That's kind of Deuteronomistic theology. Okay, so how do we apply the narratives, the stories of the Old Testament? Well, as Christians, we believe these are our stories. These were the identity-forming stories of Israel. Israel was God's people. We are God's people. Therefore, they are also part of our identity forming stories. We are, as Paul says in Romans, as Gentile Christians, we have been grafted into the tree. But we are part of the tree. And so these are our stories. These books reflect God meeting His people where they were at particular points in history. And of course, the God that they served is the God that we served. And so the illustrations of God meeting them helps us understand how God meets us. Now, they lived, thousands of years ago, and 3,000 years ago. What does it mean for God to meet people who lived 3,000 years ago? Well, it's going to be maybe a little different from God meeting us today. In fact, it may be a little bit different than God meeting the New Testament believers in certain ways. And I think as I finish these slides, you might see some of the ways in which that we also have to believe that the picture of God that we get in the Old Testament is still not as complete as the picture of God that we get in the New Testament. Now that's a matter of controversy, but I think that if we listen to the text, that they bear this out. The New Testament provides us with additional theological perspectives on the stories of the Old Testament. So the New Testament is and this is a matter of disagreement, but I think that anyone who really listens to the Old Testament text will come to the conclusion that the New Testament is not cluing us in. The function of the New Testament reference to the Old Testament is not to clue us in on the original meanings of the Old Testament, but that in fact what we are getting in the New Testament are extra meanings of the Old Testament. So Paul's understanding of Adam is arguably much more extensive than the Old Testament's understanding of Adam. In fact, Adam doesn't appear hardly at all in the Old Testament. Adam is in Genesis 2 and 3, and that's really about it. There is no definitive place anywhere else where we can say with absolute certainty that Adam, the person of Genesis, is clearly being referred to. And there are some differences in the way that Paul applies the story of Adam than the way that Genesis does. Genesis never uses the word disobedience or condemnation. Certainly there's no word for sin nature in Genesis. Actually, I don't think there's any word for sin nature in Paul. But there is flesh, and Romans 7 has something similar. But arguably, much of our Christian understanding of the Adam story doesn't even come from Paul, but comes from St. Augustine, who lived several hundred years after Paul. In the Genesis story, Adam and Eve would have died anyway. The only way that Adam and Eve would have lived forever in the Genesis story is if they had eaten from the tree of life. Paul doesn't talk about it that way. Paul talks about it in terms of Adam's sin bringing death. The serpent is not called Satan in Genesis. In fact, we have no evidence of any Jew referring to the serpent as Satan until the 1st century BC, even after the Old Testament. There's nowhere in the Old Testament where the serpent is referred to as Satan. So what am I getting at? I'm saying that the New Testament often gives us a sensus plenior, a fuller sense, an extra sense of Old Testament passages that goes beyond what the Old Testament passages would have, the way they would have been understood within Israel itself. And so, in any case, the New Testament gives us some God-sanctioned ways of applying the Old Testament narratives, even though it goes beyond the Old Testament narratives themselves, in my opinion. Now, what I've just said is a matter of fighting words in some circles, but I don't see any way that anyone who listens to the text will come to any other conclusions. I don't think it's ambiguous in the slightest, what I just said. It's just that it messes with certain people's way of thinking of things, and that's why it's controversial. It's not controversial because it's ambiguous. In my opinion, it's controversial because it requires some people to change their point of view. Some important considerations when applying Old Testament letters. One, this is true of any narrative. Remember that description is not prescription. Just because something is described in a story doesn't mean that we should go out and do it. So Judas went out and hanged himself is not a prescription for how I should go, what I should go do after I'm done with this video. So always beware that you need to be discerning as to whether what is being described in a text is being prescribed in a text. So Gideon put out a fleece to decide God's will. If the grass around it is wet but the fleece is dry, then I'll know such and such. That's not necessarily a prescription for us to go find God's will. It is a description of something in the life of Gideon. Now, stories can also illustrate truths and principles or ethics that are clarified elsewhere. So certainly if you read Fee and Stewart's How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, they would tell you not to read a story allegorically or not to apply a story as prescriptive unless you can find some other biblical text where it is very clearly said that you are to behave a certain way or do a certain thing. Now, here I said I would talk about the Deuteronomistic history. Remember that the Deuteronomistic history has an incomplete view of God's blessing and justice. Not all suffering is a consequence of sin. Jesus suffered. It was not a consequence of sin. And yet if all we had was the Deuteronomistic history of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, we might very well come to the conclusion that if you've suffered, it's because you've sinned. That is a possible way of reading the Deuteronomistic history. However, the rest of the Bible tells us that that's not the complete truth. Sometimes suffering is a consequence of sin, but sometimes it isn't. Similarly, the righteous are not always blessed in this world. There is a reward and punishment after death. There is no clear teaching about the afterlife in Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, or Kings. There is no clear teaching of reward or punishment in the afterlife in those books. That's something we learn from the rest of Scripture. Now, Ezekiel and Jeremiah push back a little bit on Deuteronomistic theology. There was a saying going in the time of the exile, our fathers ate sour grapes, and it's our teeth that hurt. And both Ezekiel 18 and Jeremiah 31 say, let's stop saying this saying. From now on, God's going to make a change, and it's going to be the person that does the sinning that's going to die. And so even the Old Testament pushes back a little bit on the Deuteronomistic theology, arguably. God does not directly tempt or cause evil. We know this from James 1. And yet there are places in the Deuteronomistic history, for example, where we don't have that complete an understanding. Now, certainly God allows everything that happens, but as Christians, we don't believe that God actually tries to get people to do evil. Yet in the stories of Kings and Samuel, we see God sending evil spirits. It's very interesting to compare Samuel and the Deuteronomistic history with Chronicles. Chronicles comes several, sometime after, and is a reworking of Kings from a later theological perspective. It's interesting. There's a verse in 2 Samuel 24:1 that says that God put it in the heart of David to number the children of Israel in sin. That same passage in 1 Chronicles 21:1 says that it was Satan who put it in the heart of David to number the children of Israel. So Samuel says that God did something that Chronicles says that Satan did. Could it be, though, that Chronicles, with a slightly later, more developed understanding, sees Satan as the one who directly tempts, and that God is, obviously God has to sign off on it because he's God, he's in control of everything, but he does not directly cause evil. So there would be an example where the theology of 2 Samuel is not as developed or complete as the theology of 1 Chronicles. And so this is why you have to take the whole counsel of God and all of Scripture into account when you're applying Old Testament narratives, because we have a fuller understanding in the New Testament of God and of theology than the Old Testament arguably has. And of course, there are some narratives in the writings grouping of the Old Testament, in the writings section of the Old Testament. So Chronicles is a later version of Samuel and Kings with a slightly different, more complete theological perspective. There's a lot more on the temple, for example, in Chronicles. A lot more of a focus on the temple than there was in the earlier versions. Ruth and Esther are nice little short stories, little vignettes in Israel's history. Job is about the problem of evil, and it has some narrative in it. Now, I personally don't believe that the concept of the Satan existed until after Israel returned from the exile. Satan is not mentioned in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 1 Kings. Satan is not mentioned until Chronicles, and Satan's also mentioned in Job 1, which is why I personally think that Job 1 comes after the exile. I don't know when the rest of the story was written, but that the first part of Job, I believe, is late. And of course, the fact that Job is in the writings also suggests to me that Job is late, since I think most of the writings reached their current form arguably after the exile. Maybe all of the Old Testament did, but that's not important right now. And then Ezra and Nehemiah continue the story of Chronicles into that post-exilic period. Well, this has been an overview of the narrative parts of the Old Testament, with a few warnings and a few suggestions on applying them. Of course, if you've seen the video in this series on applying the Gospels, In that video, we talked about some of the basic dynamics of applying a narrative, finding evaluative points of view, looking at the characters, at the events, and at the settings. But hopefully this video has given you some sense of some of the different issues that exist and that people have talked about from time to time in relation to the narratives of the Old Testament and how to apply them.